Today, this week rather, not today. And we concluded the unit on Ohr Miklat. Remember the sequence. The sequence of the Sefer is relatively logical. We had 7 years of conquest. Then we had 7 years of division of the land. That's 14 years. And afterwards, there are two things that are then set up after the division of the land. The first is the Ohr Miklat that we looked at. And the second is the rest of the cities of the Leviim. Remember that the 6 Ohr Miklat, 3 west of the Yarden and 3 over the Yarden, are also Ohr Leviim. But there's going to be another 42 Ohr Leviim that are set up. There's a total of 48 Levite cities that are scattered throughout Eretz Yisrael. And the designation of those cities is the topic right after the Ohr Miklat themselves were set up. The remez, that Shevet Levi would be scattered, goes all the way back to Yaakov Avinu's blessing. I made this point before. When Yaakov Avinu cursed Shimon and Levi, he talked about they should both be dispersed. I shall divide them among Yaakov, I shall scatter them among Yisrael. And keep in mind that both Shimon and Levi have a certain element of dispersion, but in different ways. Shimon is dispersed because Shimon has isolated cities that are located in the Chelik of Yehuda. Levi is dispersed throughout the length and width of Eretz Yisrael, and the Meforshim explain that Shimon was dispersed because they were dangerous. Their tendency towards violence, if they would be too concentrated, might spill out. So Shimon is contained within the dominant tribe of Yehuda. Levi is the other way around. Levi, whose zealousness was utilized to serve God, right, that same zealousness that resulted in the killing of Shechem, was turned into devotion to Hashem. So as a result, they are dispersed throughout the Jewish people in order that every segment of Klal Yisrael should have the beneficial influence of Shevet Levi. So that's why Yaakov uses two lashonos. Achalkeim b'Yaakov, afitzeim b'Yisrael. This is in Parshas Vayechi. I will divide them among Yaakov, I will scatter them among Yisrael. There's a remez that both Shimon and Levi are going to be dispersed, but they are dispersed for different reasons and in different ways. Shevet Levi is said that they cannot own regular land in Eretz Yisrael. They simply have the Ohr Leviim, and they were primarily supported by maasros and various other gifts that were given to Kohanim and Leviim. Now, the way the division works, on one hand, you have 48 cities, and you have 12 tribes, meaning not counting not counting Levi, you have 12 tribes because Ephraim and Manasseh are divided into 2 tribes. So you might have guessed, well, okay, if there are 48 cities and there are 12 tribes, each tribe would have 4 Levite cities. Well, it's close, but it's not exactly that. Meaning the way it works, if you look at the listing, is that Yehuda has 5, and Naphtali has 3, but every other tribe does have 4. So in other words, it is the case that on the average, every Shevet had 4 Ohr Leviim located within their borders, except for Naphtali around the Yam Kinneret that only had 3, and Yehuda that had 5. Okay, so that's the first thing to remember. 48 cities. Yehuda has 5, Naphtali has 3. Every other tribe has 4. Now we're going to see Manasseh has a certain peculiarity, because Manasseh is the only tribe that part of it is on the east Yarden and part of it is on the west, and you're going to see in a moment why that's going to be a significant difference. Yeah.
So with Yehuda, it's kind of interesting. They hosted both a little more Levite cities than the rest of the tribes, and they hosted Shimon.
And Shimon, yeah.
Was there anything that made them distinct to be kind of like a hosting tribe more than others?
Well, it could very. Yehuda, of course, number one, has very large territory. At least if you learn, like Rashi, that the territories differed between the tribes. And number two, Yehuda is Malchus. So one can understand that only the Malchus of Yehuda could contain the potential violence of Shimon.
Right.
But because of that potential violence, they needed an extra Kedusha of Yehuda, of Levi, 5 Levi cities. But of course, keep in mind that Shimon itself, I mean, it's interesting. In a sense, Yehuda had a double dose because Shimon also gave 4 of its cities to Leviim. So it's interesting. Within the Chelek of Yehuda, we have 5 Ohr Leviim that are Yehuda, and 4 Ohr Leviim that were given from the Shimon cities. So really, you could say, looking at Yehuda's map, there are 9 Ohr Leviim there, 5 and 4. Okay, now the pasuk or the parak divides Shevet Levi into 4 groupings. Now again, let me remind you from the Chumash itself. Levi had 3 sons: Gershon, Kahas, and Merari. And just to remind you, Kahas's son was Amram. One of Kahas's sons was Amram. And of course, Amram had Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. However, Kahas had other sons who became regular Leviim. That Korach ben Yitzhar ben Kahas. Right, Kahas had 4 sons: Amram, Yitzhar, Chevron, Uzziah. So the children of Amram are Moshe and Aaron. Chevron, Yitzhar, and Uzziah, they became Leviim. Now, just to remind you, in the Midbar, during the 40 years of the Midbar, Gershon, Kahas, and Merari had distinct jobs in the transportation of the Mishkan. Kahas carried the Aron HaKodesh and the Mizbeach, and they carried it on their shoulders. There were no wagons for them. The Aron HaKodesh was carried on the shoulders and the Mizbeach on poles, even though Chazal say, miraculously, the Aron carried you, but whatever it is, but if you would look at the picture, you would see them carrying the Aron. Gershon transported the tapestries and curtains, and they did it by wagons. And Merari transported the heavy lifting, the boards and the beams, and that too was wagons. Okay, so Gershon and Merari transported their loads through the agalos, the wagons. Kahas carried their load with avoda bakasef on their shoulder. Now, when the Ohr Leviim are allocated to Bnei Yisrael, Shevet Levi is divided into 4 groups. Group 1 are the Kohanim. Group 2 are the remainder of Kahas, meaning the Kahas who are not Kohanim, who are Leviim. Group 3 are Gershon. And group 4 are Merari. Okay, so Kohanim, rest of Bnei Kahas, Gershon, and Merari. The Kohanim are given a total of 13 cities. The rest of Bnei Kahas are given a total of 10 cities. Okay, 13 for Kohanim, 10 for the rest of Bnei Kahas. Bnei Gershon are given 13 cities. And Bnei Merari are given 12 cities. So add up those numbers. Hopefully, if we're lucky, it'll add up to 48. It should add up to 48. We have 13 and 10 is 23. 23 and 13 is 36. And 36 and 12 is 48. Bingo. But it's a little odd, and I can't fully explain the pattern here. Kohanim get 13. The rest of Kahas gets 10. Gershon gets 13. Merari gets 12. Okay, that is how the cities were divided in Eretz Yisrael. I'm sorry, is there a Tanakh here? I want to read you some of the details. Yeah, thank you. I have it. Yeah, thanks. I have it. Yeah, Yeshakach. Again, you can look at it, but I want to call your attention to the specific breakdown of the 48 cities. First of all, the idea that there are 13 cities for Kohanim. How many Kohanim were there at this time? Remember that Elazar, the Kohen Gadol, is still alive. That's Aaron's son, right? Aaron died in the desert. The Kohen Gadol at the time of the Chalukas Haaretz is Elazar. And then it also mentions his son Pinchas. In the Midbar, there were a total, there's Aaron, and Aaron had 4 sons, but 2 of those sons died, Nadav and Avihu. So in the Midbar, you had Aaron, you had Elazar and Isamar, and you had Pinchas. There were a total of 4 Kohanim in the desert. Now this is around 28 years after they entered Eretz Yisrael. The 14 years of the 7 years of, it's only 14 years. Yeah, the 7 years of Kibush, the 7 years of Chiluk. So, when they entered Eretz Yisrael, there were only 4 Kohanim. Actually, only 3 Kohanim. Aaron had died. Now it's 14 years later. How many Kohanim do you think you have to get 13 cities? Are there 100 Kohanim? That would be pretty big. Are there 1,000 Kohanim? Almost impossible. They need 13 cities. Now, how large were the cities? But even if we assume the cities were relatively small villages, it's absolutely clear there were not enough Kohanim to fill up 13 cities. So the answer has to be that these were designated for the future, meaning to say it could be, I'm not sure who lived in them in the interim, it could be that until you have enough of a population of Kohanim, Leviim were permitted to live there, or maybe even regular people, non-Leviim, were permitted to live there. But they were set aside to be cities for Kohanim. All I'm saying is, it must have been a number of years till Kohanim actually filled up those cities. Okay, but be it as it may, the cities of Kohanim, which add up to 13 cities, were located in 3 tribes. Yehuda, who had 5 of those cities. Shimon, who had 4 of those cities. And Binyamin, who had 4 of those cities. So it's 5, 4, 4. Right? Now again, remember your map. Yehuda is from Yerushalayim southward all the way to the southern border. Shimon is Muvla in Yehuda, and Binyamin is directly north of Yehuda, and the Beis HaMikdash straddles, it's in between Yehuda and Binyamin. So this actually makes perfect sense. The cities of Kohanim were located in proximity to what would eventually be the Beis HaMikdash. Now this is interesting because remember, at this point, there is no Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. At this point, the Beis HaMikdash, or not the Mishkan, is far north in Shiloh, which is in the Chelek of Ephraim. So, in terms of immediate need, it might have made more sense to locate the Kohanim in Ephraim, but it's very clear that this plan is based on the future, where the Beis HaMikdash from the time of Shlomo onwards is going to be in Yerushalayim. So the 13 cities of Kohanim are in the Chelek of Yehuda, Shimon, and Binyamin. Okay, and it is 5-4-4. 5 cities in Yehuda, 4 cities in Binyamin, 4 cities in Shimon. And Shimon gave up 4 of its cities to Leviim. Okay, that's clear. By the way, just to give you a name, a famous city, one of the cities of Binyamin, that was a city of Kohanim, was Anossos, Be'eretz Binyamin, and this name is mentioned at the beginning of Sefer Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu the Navi was a Navi from Anossos in Binyamin, and we know Yirmiyahu was a Kohen. Yirmiyahu a Navi was a Kohen, and he came from Anossos, Be'eretz Binyamin. Let me just find something else about the Kohanim cities here. 1 second. Hebron is a Kohen city, and even though we learned that Hebron was given to Kalev ben Yefuneh, but those are the suburbs of Hebron. Hebron itself was a city of Kohanim. Okay, Anasos. Okay, that's fine. Alrighty, so that's the 13 cities of the Kohanim. Yehuda, Binyamin, Shimon. Now, the remainder of Kahas, right, the Bnei Kahas who are not Kohanim, they get 10 cities. Now, how are those cities allocated? Ephraim gives 4. Okay, remember your map? Ephraim is north of Binyamin. Okay, Ephraim is north of Binyamin. So 4 of their cities go to the rest of Bnei Kahas. Dan gives 4 cities. Dan is along the Mediterranean coast to the south. So that actually means a little bit. Again, I don't know the reasons for all of this, but this does mean that the Bnei Kahas are a bit split, meaning they're not necessarily geographically next to each other. 4 cities are in Ephraim. 4 cities are done along the southern Mediterranean coast. Remember, Dan had 2 territories. Their main territory was on the Mediterranean coast, but then they had conquered a city that they called Dan all the way north, and some say it was even outside of Eretz Yisrael, but that was not where the Leviim were located. The Leviim were located on the coastal city. So that's 4, 4. And the remaining 2 were the Chelek of Menashe that was west of the Yarden. So you do have 3 tribes, but it's a 4, 4, 2. The reason why Menashe is 2 is because they will give another 2. Menashe will give 4, but they will give another 2 over the Yarden. So in terms of west of the Yarden, it's a 4, 4, 2. Okay, so 4, 4, 2 gives you 10. Okay, so again, Kohanim, Yehuda, Binyamin, Shimon. The rest of Bnei Kahas, Ephraim, Dan, 4, 4. And Menashe, west of the Yarden, 2. That's how you get 10. Okay, then we come to Gershon. And with Gershon, we have east of the Yarden, 2 of Menashe. Okay, so Menashe is the only tribe that's split between 2 different groups of Leviim. 2 of Menashe are the rest of Bnei Kahas, west. East of the Yarden, Menashe is 2. But then we go back, Yisachar is 4. Asher is 4. Naphtali is 3. Okay. Again, the Mefarshim do not really give us any particular insight into all of this, but it's Yisachar around the Kinneret. Asher is on the Mediterranean coast north of Dan, so it's 4, 4. Naphtali is 3, and Menashe has the Menashe east of the Yarden has another 2, right? So that's how you get 13, right? So again, 13 Kohanim, 10 for the rest of Bnei Kahas, 13 for Gershon. And Merari is the only one that has a straight logical 3 tribes, 4 Shvatim, 4 cities each. And that's just the remainder. That's 1 second. That is Ruvain, Gad, and Zevulun. Okay. Again, you will not be tested on this. You don't need to remember this. You can look at the psukim anyway. But it is important to see that the general pattern is every shevet is 4, except for Yehuda, which is 5, Naphtali, which is 3. But the oddity of the 4 is that Menashe is split into a 2 and 2, in which 2 are Kahas and 2 are Gershon, because Menashe is located in 2 different ways. And B'sach HaKol, we therefore have 48 Ari Leviim, but the 13 cities of Kohanim are located in close proximity to the Makam HaMikdash, in the Chalokim of Yehuda, Binyamin, and Shimon. I think I've said more than once that understanding the layout of these cities can explain the well-known question that people ask: why are there so few Leviim? Why are there more Kohanim than Leviim? Given the fact that it was a davar pashut ma'od, that Kohanim are a small part of Shevet Levi. And obviously the tribe of Levi was much larger than Kohanim, and yet today, Leviim, there are fewer Leviim. And the answer would be because most of the Levite cities were located in the 10 tribes. And when they were destroyed, many Leviim simply were killed, or they disappeared. All of the 13 cities of Kohanim were located in Malchus Yehuda, which did not undergo that destruction. And therefore, after the Chorban Bayis Rishon, there were many more Kohanim who survived than Leviim, and Ad Hayom Hazeh, that is why you have more Kohanim than you have Leviim. Right? So if you understand the geographical dispersion of the Ari Leviim, you can understand why there are fewer Leviim than Kohanim Bizman Hazeh. Okay? So this is the basic idea of Ari Leviim. Now, there are certain halachas about Ari Leviim, And that is, the Torah itself commands us that Orei Leviim have to be surrounded with an area that is called a migrash. Migrash, which actually in modern Hebrew is sometimes used for a parking lot. Chanyon is the more modern term, but migrash is also used for that. Migrash basically means pasture land, that the city has to be surrounded by pasture land that they would use to graze their animals and the like. And there is a stira in the Chumash itself, how large an area needs to be set aside for migrash. One pasuk says it's a radius of 1,000 amos around each city is migrash, right? 1,000 amos. Another pasuk, it's in the Chumash itself, says 2,000 amos. So that's a big stira. Is it 1,000 amos around the city? Or is it 2,000 amos around the city? And the Gemara explains, 1,000 amos was migrash, that's the inner 1,000, and a second 1,000 amos were sados ukramim, fields and vineyards, which is interesting, although you would get the impression that Shevet Levi was not allowed to engage in their own agricultural farming. Apparently on a small scale they were allowed to do it, meaning to say you have the city. Around the city is 1,000 amos of migrash, and around that is another 1,000 amos of sados ucharamim. By the way, both the migrash and the sados ucharamim were squared. So the way you would do it is, you would take your city, you would draw 1,000 amos or 2,000 amos, straight line, but you wouldn't make it a circle per se, you would then square it. Right? A square will be larger than the circle because you will gain the corners, right? If you put a circle with a certain radius and you draw a square having that same dimension of side, the square will be larger by 1/4 because of the corners that are added to the circle. Now, the Gemara says in Erchin that you are not allowed to convert any part of the migrash into a field, and you are not allowed to convert any part of the migrash into a city. The migrash must remain inviolate. Now, that actually raises an interesting question. That actually means the city cannot be expanded to accommodate larger populations, because what you would assume is this: you have a Levite city, and it is surrounded by migrash and then sadas uchramim. It says the city cannot be expanded into the migrash. In other words, you can't make the city bigger, because then you would be going into the migrash. So what do you do if there is overcrowding? Just an urban planning problem. Now, with Kohanim, as I say, it would be a long time till there'd be overcrowding, because they're given 13 cities and there are 5 Kohanim around. But one could imagine over time there might be a crowding problem. Well, you can always build up, right? Skyscrapers. Right? Was the concept that Levite cities would have skyscrapers? Who knows? But what is the lekach? What is the limud that you don't expand a city into a migrash? Now, this is limited to Levite cities, meaning other cities that may have pastures around them, you could certainly expand. But this is a gezerah sakas of Orei Leviim. What's the point? So if Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says, this is actually very, very interesting. I don't know if any of you went to college and took a degree in urban planning or the like, but Rav Hirsch actually uses this as a whole discussion about appropriate urban planning. That in many, many ways, just as the Leviim are the ideal Jew, the Talmud Chacham, the tzaddik, the teacher of Torah. Architecturally, the Orei Leviim are supposed to be ideal cities. So even though the Torah did not mandate that other cities follow the model of Orei Leviim, but they do represent the ideal model. Number one, that cities should have parkland around them, and you don't cut into the parkland, because the migrash was grazing, but it also was, trees and, parkland, so to speak. The importance of parks, right? So that's something the Torah is being madgish, environmentalism. But he makes another point, and that is, the idea that an ideal city should be relatively small and self-contained, and not simply get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, called urban sprawl, because then people don't know each other, they're not familiar with each other. Keep the city small. Keep it small and limited, so essentially the city becomes a neighborhood instead of some anonymous conglomeration, as big cities are. And therefore the notion is, keep the cities small and contained and environmentally friendly, because that way is more conducive to darchei shalom and relationships. Okay, so that's kind of the key of the idea of the migrash. As I say, as far as we know, although there are some shitas that apply this to all cities, but al pi halacha, the rule that you don't encroach on a migrash only applies to Orei Leviim. It does not apply to any other city. But Rav Hirsch says this is a model for how cities ought to be constructed. Yeah.
Is it at all related to the Tahum around the city that, the shogig, that he can't go to the Tahum?
Yeah. So again, let me remind you that all 48 cities are Orei Miklat, not just 6. But the Gemara in Mako says there is a difference between the 6 Orei Miklat and the other 42 Levite cities, which are also Orei Miklat. And the Gemara says that the 6 Orei Miklat protect the Rotzeach, even if he doesn't know he's in an Orei Miklat. Let's assume he doesn't know where he is. But if he is in that city or within the 2,000 amos around the city, he is protected. And if the Goel Adam kills him, the Goel Adam is chayav misa, as opposed to the other 42. The other 42 protect him only if he knows he is in the Ir Miklat, and not if he doesn't know. So if I don't know how they would say how the Goel Adam would know this, but if the Goel Adam knows that the Rotzeach doesn't know where he is, and the Goel Adam kills him, he would be patur. The Gemara darshans this from Sukkim. Now you are correct that both for the 6 and the other 42, the area of protection extends 2,000 amos beyond, which actually corresponds to the migrash plus the sados uchramim. So essentially, it makes a lot of sense. Now you can understand why he is given 2,000 amos from the city, because the 2,000 amos are part of the city, the migrash and the kramim. Remember, the first 1,000 amos, migrash, the second 1,000 amos, sados uchramim. As long as the Rotzeach is within those areas, he is still entitled to the protection of the Ir Miklat. If he takes 1 foot out of that area, he now becomes vulnerable to the Goel Hadam. And then, without getting to a very complicated sugya, there's a whole machlokus about trees. If you have a tree that is growing, the tree is growing within the Techum, but its branches extend beyond the Techum, and the Rotzeach is standing under the branches, do we assign the whole tree to within the Techum, and therefore he would be protected? Or do we say, wherever you're standing is what you are? You're inside, you're okay, you're outside, you're not okay, and we don't have this rule that if you're under the tree gets reassigned into that area. That is a huge sugya in the second parak of Maseches Makos, and if you look there, you'll see Rashi and Tosos have many, many different girsos and they discussed that particular issue. But putting aside the issue of the tree, it's fairly clear. You're within the Techum, you're okay. 1 foot out of the Techum, you're dead. Yeah.
Rav Hirsch's explanation doesn't account for the problem of overcrowding. Could Leviim live in other cities, or would
That's correct, because in modern terms, what Rav Hirsch would simply say is, instead of expanding a city, build another city. That's what he would say. In other words, build a lot of small cities instead of one big city. Problem is with Ohr Leviim, you don't necessarily have that unless, the problem is, I don't have the population figures. In other words, it could very well be that this, just as I said for Kohanim, obviously you were providing a lot more cities than you actually needed. Maybe that was true for all of them, meaning to say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu envisioned that even with a rapid population growth, we've given enough small cities that's going to be taken care of. And it could very well be that that actually fits. Without having exact numbers, it's hard to know, but maybe that's the cheshbon why there are so many cities. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is that latter explanation is in fact there were enough smaller cities provided for that
Yeah.
the overcrowding? Wouldn't the implication also be that we already would know the maximum number of Leviim?
Well, yeah, I think that's the situation. Meaning to say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu set up these arrangements, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew what the future populations would be. So again, there's so many things that we don't really have clear. Meaning, if we were to take a snapshot at any given moment, were a lot of these cities ghost towns? Meaning, if the cities were cheshboned based on maximum population growth, and most of the time you haven't reached that maximum. So were they half empty? It's hard to know. Or maybe they were augmented by other people who could live there and the like. Now, there are a few other halachos about Levite cities. Levite cities cannot be sold. So if you're a Levi who lives in a city or a Kohen, and some Yisrael offers you $1 million to buy your house in the Levite city, there is an issur to sell Ohr Leviim. Ohr Leviim are not to be sold. Apparently, even between Leviim, they're not to be sold. You get what you get. However, they can be inherited. And they can be inherited even by a Yisrael. Let's take this case. Let's imagine that you're a Levi, and you're married, and you have no sons. You only have a daughter. And your daughter marries a Yisrael from Ephraim, any tribe. When the father dies, the property goes to his daughter because there's no sons. That's the precedent, of course, of B'no Salavcha that we looked at. So the daughter now inherits her father's property in the Levite city. When the daughter eventually dies, if she has sons, if she has a husband, it'll go to her husband. The husband gets over the sons. And when the husband dies, it'll go to his sons. If her husband already died, then when she dies, it'll go to her sons. Now, her sons are not Leviim. Her sons are B'nai Ephraim. So the owners of this property in the Levite city are B'nai Ephraim. Now, once again, we have no statistics here. But over time, there is at least a theoretical possibility that a lot of the property in Levite cities was in fact owned by non-Leviim. That they got it through the inheritance from the daughters of Kohanim and Leviim who did not have sons. That actually might address the ghost town problem, because in the sense that you may have had non-Leviim living there. And as far as I know, they were not discouraged. They were not kicked out. There was no announcement to say, hey, if you're not a Levi, get out of here. If you owned the property, halachically, now again, the property could not be sold. That's true. But if through Yerusha you owned the property, you are allowed to stay there. Okay, so that's an interesting point, that a lot of the Arei Leviim theoretically could have been possessed by non-Leviim. Okay, so this is kind of the basic information you need to know about Arei Leviim, and these are the two last organizational arrangements that Yehoshua ben Nun did, setting up the Arei Miklat and setting up the 48 Arei Leviim. So this now brings us to Perek Chaf Beis. We'll look at tomorrow, chapter 22. And Perek Chaf Beis is the official ceremony. Actually, it's very moving in some ways, of Ruvain, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe being allowed to return home after more than 14 years. They are being officially, it's a discharge ceremony. That they did their job, they kept their oath, they kept their promise to Moshe Rabbeinu and to Hashem, and they are sent home with a bracha. The significance of why Tanakh records this kind of official discharge ceremony, because the problem is going to be that they're living over the Yarden, and in the course of many years, the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael may look at them and not remember what they did and kind of said, oh, these people never cared about us. They did not participate in our struggles. We fought for them because before we crossed the Yarden, we all conquered that land. We conquered their land. But they were totally indifferent to us. So it was thought, al pi nevuah, al pi Hashem, that it was very, very, very important that it be publicly recorded that Ruvain, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe faithfully fulfilled their obligations and were sent home with the bracha of Yoshua, and more importantly, the bracha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Keep in mind that they were away from their wives and children for 14 years. 14 years. Now, does that mean they didn't see them at all? Well, again, I'm assuming, we don't know, that they may have had leave. I mean, they may have been able to go across the Yarden for Shabbos or whatever it is. So we don't have to assume they had not seen their wives for 14 years, but they were essentially on duty. One question I want to leave you with, though, that's not really clear to me at all. If we say there were 7 years of active conquest, and then 7 years of division of the land, why did Ruvain, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe have to stick around for the last 7 years? I understand as long as we were fighting battles, they have to be there to participate in the fighting of the battle. But they have to hang around as we go through the lotteries and the divisions and the assessments. Now, it's very clear from the Psukim that they were not sent home until the Chalukas Ha'aretz was completed. So one question to think about is, why? It seems like they were there 7 years longer than they had to be. That's a long time. Okay, so we'll talk about that tomorrow.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.